Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, dear listeners, welcome back to the podcast and thank you for tuning in to this Q&A episode. Thank you very much to everyone who submitted a question. Without further ado, let's get straight into the first one, which is very interesting to me because I'm a nerd. This question is actually divided into two parts, and it reads as follows. Do muscles have a maximum amount of glycogen stores, and is there a time limit prior to exercise they store them for? Let's start with the first part of the question. Do muscles have a maximum amount of glycogen stores? The answer is yes. We store glycogen in our muscles and in our liver. In the liver, we store 80 to 100 grams of glycogen, which equals to about 320 to 400 calories, whereas in our total muscle mass, we store between 400 and 800 grams of glycogen, depending on the size of the person and the size of the muscle mass that they carry. And that equals to about 1600 to 3200 calories max. We also have blood glucose, so glucose, not yet glycogen, in our blood. And that's about 0.9 grams of glucose per liter of blood, which is about 12 calories for every 3 grams of glucose. And I wanted to mention glucose because once we reach a certain glucose threshold in our bloods, past which that glucose could become toxic for us, that's when the body brings down those glucose levels by either utilizing the glucose for something or storing the excess as glycogen. So glycogen is simply the storage form of carbs, and its original form is glucose. In answer to the second part of the question, is there a time limit prior to exercise they store them for? I had to reread this part a couple of times to make sure that I understood it, and I'm still not 100% sure I do get it, so please, question asker, if the answer is not what you were after, just contact me and I will explain what you meant, and I will do my best to answer the real question. But the way I understand this question is you're asking if after a certain amount of time, since storing that glycogen, the body gets rid of it. And the answer is no. Muscle glycogen and liver glycogen as well can be stored for as long as needed until you require it for any activity. If you already have enough glucose in your blood to perform that task, then your glycogen is going to be untouched. But if you don't have enough glucose already in your blood and you need to perform a task with a specific muscle, the glycogen stored within that specific muscle will be depleted by a certain extent. The body will take the amount of glycogen it needs in order to perform that task, and it will utilize it for the task. So once you have that glycogen stored, it will be stored until it's necessary. Now, when it comes to hypertrophy-specific training, it's important to understand that you're likely not going to fully deplete your muscle glycogen after a training session, especially if you complete it after having had at least one meal instead of being completely fasted. And even if you were completely fasted, it's unlikely you're going to fully deplete muscle glycogen because most training sessions for hypertrophy only target a few muscle groups at a time, unless we're talking about complete full body sessions. which means that you're only going to deplete the glycogen stored within the muscles that you're actually using. And in addition to that, you're going to deplete them by a certain extent, not necessarily in full. There was some research that came out a few years ago that suggested that we seem to deplete 30 to 40% of our glycogen stores after an average resistance training session. And as far as I know, the overall evidence suggests that as long as you're eating enough carbohydrates within a 24-hour period and you're training once a day, then that's going to be enough to replenish your muscle glycogen before your next session. It's different if you train twice per day, in which case it would behoove you to consume carbohydrates between the sessions to ensure a faster replenishment of glycogen. But the amount of carbohydrates, you should consume, and the timing of that carbohydrate depends on the timing of the two sessions and on you as a person. So I can't give blanket recommendations. Question number 2. Again, this is actually multiple questions in one. So I'm going to read them all to begin with, and then I'm going to focus on each individual component. Why is one muscle weaker than the other? As in, left bicep can do 8 reps at RPE 8, but right ends up 8 reps at RPE 9.5. Will there ever be a time when they're equal enough to trust a long bar curl versus dumbbells? Or will one side inevitably begin to overcompensate / engage more than the other? Let's start with, why is one muscle weaker than the other? The simple answer is that the human body is asymmetrical. Even though we look roughly the same, the key word is roughly. We're not exactly the same on each side. Just like you might have one eye slightly bigger than the other, or one leg slightly longer than the other. Will there ever be a time when the two sides are equal enough to trust a long bar curl versus dumbbells, or will one side inevitably begin to overcompensate / engage more than the other? Now, I get the impression that you, question asker, may be overthinking the issue of asymmetry. In most cases, if the discrepancy is 1 or 1.5 repetition, so you mentioned RPE 8 versus RPE 9.5, we're talking about a repetition and a half, because each point on the RPE scale equals 1 repetition closer to failure. This is a scenario in which I am not concerned about the discrepancy, and I would program either a long bar curl or a dumbbell curl without worrying too much about the fact that the two sides are not going to work at the same rate. My approach is typically to start with the weaker side when doing unilateral exercises, so with one limb at a time. You hit the proximity to failure that you intended on the weaker side, and then you repeat the same number of reps with the same load on the stronger side. And I like this approach because over time, the weaker side is going to get stronger at a slightly faster pace than the already stronger side. So the discrepancy in strength, and therefore the asymmetry, is going to reduce itself, but I doubt that it will ever completely disappear. And it's just not a concern of mine. The asymmetry is a natural state for the body. So I would say that you could already try a long bar curl if you've never done it before, and you're bored to death with your dumbbell curls, and potentially use my approach. I would suggest or program for a client more unilateral work for the weaker side, only if the asymmetry was actually pretty substantial. For example, let's say that somebody got injured and couldn't train one side of the body for 6 to 10 weeks, but they could train the other one, which I would recommend. And so the injured side loses strength and muscle mass. That's when I would actually recommend a period of time where you're training the weakened side more than the other side to correct that asymmetry, because that can actually affect your daily life as well as your appearance. So that's when I would do more sets on the injured or weakened side. You don't have to have got injured. Sometimes people are naturally very asymmetrical in a particular set of muscle groups. So, for example, I think I've told this story before, but my client Corey used to have a calf that was way bigger than the other, to a point where he said, I can see it in the mirror, at which point I started training his smaller calf much more than the bigger calf, so that we got to a point where the asymmetry was still there, but less noticeable, and he was less bothered with it. But if you're not in that position, then asymmetry is normal, and I wouldn't want you to overthink it at the expense of training variation, which could be beneficial for hypertrophy. Question number 3. Do you have any tips for reducing the caloric content of a restaurant meal, since those are usually really high in calories, even when they're on the healthier side, in quotation marks? This is an excellent question, and it's especially relevant if you're the kind of person who eats out a lot, usually by necessity, maybe because of your job. And these are the suggestions that I would make. First of all, choose an entree that contains ideally one ingredient per meal component. And the meal components that I think about when I'm putting together a meal are the following: protein, carbs, fats, and fruit or vegetables, which means that you're going to choose an entree with a single source of lean protein. And of course, if you are vegan, you're going to have to be a little bit more flexible and focus more on food portions than on having completely lean protein, because even complete sources of vegan protein like soy will always contain a certain amount of carbs and fats. So for you, what you need to focus on is keeping the portions of the meals overall under control, rather than trying to get pure, in quotation marks, macros, because it's like realistically not going to happen. Anyway, so it would be one source of lean protein, one source of carbohydrates, and then one side comprised of vegetables or fruit, and finally one source of fat, which typically you don't need to seek out because they always add fat in cooking at a restaurant. Speaking of which, my second suggestion is to request that the cook uses less or no oil. You can ask for a cooking method that doesn't require oil or butter or another added fat, for example, grilling or steaming or boiling. You can ask for the dressing on the side, so you control how much you put on, if any. You want to keep your meal to a single plate without any seconds or without additional plates. So instead of having an appetizer, a main, a side, and a dessert, you're just going to stick with the main, prioritizing lean protein and fruit and vegetables. And these are the best ways in which you can control the caloric content of restaurant meals. When you apply these suggestions, you end up with a health-promoting meal that helps you hit your protein and your fiber targets, as well as the other nutrient targets that you may have, without breaking the calorie bank. In addition to that, it's going to be greater in volume than it would have been had you not made these changes. So even if the caloric content is still a little bit higher than you would want it to be, at least you're getting a larger portion than you would have otherwise. And this is helpful because my final suggestion is that you can simply leave food on the plate, or eat half of it and take the rest home with you. And I know that often we don't want to do that because it feels like a waste. But my argument is that if you are force feeding essentially and not eating in alignment with your goals because it feels like a waste otherwise, you are using your body as a bin, because that's where we put food waste. And I don't think that's respectful towards you and your body and your goals. Question number 4. You said that your maintenance calories can be lower after losing weight. Is there any way to keep them where they were prior to weight loss? First of all, while it's true that maintenance calories tend to be lower after losing weight, that happens when you lose a substantial amount of weight. For example, if you lose 10% of your body weight or more, then realistically, yes, you're going to be in a much smaller body, you're going to burn a much smaller amount of energy. Your maintenance calories, if you maintain the exact same activity levels as before, are going to be lower. And this is important because there is a way to keep your maintenance calories higher, and that is to make up for the loss of weight that used to burn a certain amount of calories by exercising more. So you increase your caloric expenditure with the extra exercise, and in some cases, you can actually close the gap between your new maintenance calories and your old maintenance calories. Saying that, is it worth it? Because in some cases, maybe it doesn't take that much extra activity. But in other cases, especially if the body weight loss was quite substantial, then the change in lifestyle required is going to be very demanding. And I would not recommend as a coach to make fitness into your entire life so that you can eat a certain amount of calories. This isn't what I would consider a health promoting relationship with food and exercise from either a physical or a mental perspective, because physically you're going to exhaust yourself to burn all these calories, and mentally you're going to start associating food with a reward for all of your activity, and you start associating exercise with some form of punishment or chore that you must perform to allow yourself to eat a certain amount of calories. Which brings me to an interesting point, which I invite you to give some thought to, which is that this is an important consideration to make when you need to decide how much body fat you want to lose, because your goal physique may not be your leanest physique. For example, it wasn't for me. When I dieted down to my leanest physique to date, I got into shape for a photo shoot, and I was eating a lower amount of calories than I'm eating now because I was about 15 pounds lighter than I am now. And while I was really lean, which for some people might be aesthetically pleasing, I would have needed to exercise a lot in order to have the same maintenance calories that I have now. And it simply wasn't feasible. Not only that, but I also was experiencing a lot of symptoms that suggested that I was below my lower intervention point, meaning I was below the range of body fat within which my body thrives. And for all of these reasons, number one, I wasn't happy with the amount of calories that I was maintaining my weight on. It simply wasn't sustainable relative to the kind of lifestyle I like to live. But I also didn't want to live a lifestyle that revolved around increasing my energy expenditure by the amount that was necessary. And number two, I was experiencing these unpleasant symptoms. I was constantly food focused and hungry. I was constantly criticizing my physique, even though it was so lean and I had so much muscle definition. I had mood swings and I wasn't sleeping well at night, and my training performance was severely affected. Right now, I am progressing at a much faster rate than back then, simply due to being in a body fat range that my body is happy with. So, when you're thinking about how much weight you want to lose, you need to take this into account. And sometimes you might decide that while you would like to be leaner from an aesthetic perspective, you need to be a little bit less lean while still being within ideally a health promoting body fat range for you in order to live the lifestyle that you want to live. So that's something that you're going to have to think about when you're no longer classified as obese or overweight. You could certainly experiment with it. For instance, a client of mine, M, went through a very successful fat loss phase. They became the leanest they'd ever been with the most amount of muscle they'd ever had. But after a few months, they told me, I can't sustain this lifestyle. I want to be eating more calories and I don't want to worry so much about the food that I'm eating or the exercise that I'm doing. So right now, we are somewhere in between the highest body weight that they started with and the leanest they ever achieved with me. And we're trying to find the sweet spot for them. And you can also go through a similar phase of self discovery. Although I would recommend, if you're thinking of becoming very, very lean, maybe the leanest you've ever been before, to do it with the help of a coach that can support you, because mentally, due to the symptoms that I've mentioned that you could encounter, it can be taxing, and you wouldn't want to accidentally ruin your relationship with exercise, food, and your body image with these experiments. It's always good to have a professional on your side that knows what they're doing and that knows what to expect. Because if you've never done it before, you won't have any expectations due to the lack of experience. Now, the final question for today is training related. Any ab exercises you find particularly effective for yourself and or your clients? I wouldn't say I have some exercises that I find especially effective, but I do take a certain approach to ab training that I want to talk you through, because I find that most people who start working with me don't have a good grasp of how to train their abs, mainly due to what you see on social media, where you see people doing 40 reps at a time, super fast, with very little control, swinging and using momentum. And it feels very taxing. It makes you sweat, it's hard, it burns, but it's not very effective. So my first step with somebody who isn't getting the results they want from their ab training is to program an exercise called an abs crunch on the floor. And there are several variations that you can work your way through. You can start with your arms along your sides, which is the easiest variation. You can then move on to having your hands by your ears, which is slightly harder. Then you put your hands overhead. And once you've out-strength that variation as well, you can move on to using a little bit of weight. This is a very basic exercise to learn how to crunch your abs. And the way I coach it is I explain that your abs start at the bottom of your rib cage and they end at the top of your pelvis. So if you identify those 2 points on your body, you can actually put your fingers over them, and you simply think about bringing them as close together as possible. That's going to solely engage your abs. If you move past that point and you start sitting up, now you're using your hip flexors, you're doing a sit-up. So you're no longer isolating the abs. So if your goal is to maximize the growth of your abs, you need to be purely isolating the abs as much as possible. So you need to reduce the range of motion. And then on the eccentric, when you're not crunching, but you are unfurling back to the starting position, you want to think about controlling that movement instead of snapping back like a rubber band. Once you've mastered the basic abs crunch, one of the exercises that I like the most and I find most effective is the rope kneeling cable crunch, where you have a rope as the handle on a functional trainer. You have the pulley set at the highest possible height. You're kneeling in front of the functional trainer with the rope held basically behind your neck, with your hands on either side of your head. And you are going to crunch like you would on the ground, but you crunch downwards because you're sitting on your haunches. The reason why I like it so much is that it increases the range of motion compared to the basic abs crunch on the floor, because you can fully crunch down, but then you can also fully extend the back and get a nice stretch in the abdominals. And research suggests that the stretch position, the lengthened position of a muscle, is important for hypertrophy. So I'm always trying to find ways to help a client maximize the range of motion in the lengthened position. Another exercise I really like is the captain's chair leg raise. And When you start out, you might want to do a knee raise. And once you master this variation, you're going to straighten your legs. So the difference is that the knee raise is performed with your legs bent, whereas the straight-legged variation, well, you're going to straighten your legs. The difference between the two exercises, the kneeling, cable, rope, abs crunch, and the leg raise or knee raise, is that the leg raise is the opposite movement, where instead of crunching from the bottom of the rib cage down, you're crunching from the top of the pelvis up. So you're going to feel more of a sensation of effort in the lower part of the abs rather than the upper part when you're doing the knee raise or leg raise, and vice versa. This leads some people to believe that there's an upper abdominal and a lower abdominal, but that's not the case. The rectus abdominis is a single muscle that stretches from the bottom of the rib cage to the top of the pelvis. So I typically like to combine these two exercises or other exercises that are available to the clients, where you crunch from the bottom of the rib cage down and then from the top of the pelvis up, for variation and to make sure that we cover all of the muscle fibers involved and train them within different ranges of motion from different angles to get a complete package in terms of muscle growth. So in summary, I usually start with the abs crunch on the floor to really teach someone how to crunch their abs, and then I move on to variations where you get a little bit more range of motion while crunching from the bottom of the rib cage down, or you're crunching from the top of the pelvis up. With that, that's all of my questions for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you want to work with me, I'm currently taking on online clients, so you can use the links in the show notes to shoot me your application form, and I'll book you in for a free consultation so that we can get the ball rolling. You're going to find all of the information about my coaching on my website, including my prices. And if you want to connect with me, shoot me an email or a DM on Instagram or on Facebook, and I will be very happy to help. As always, thank you for being generous with your time, and I will speak to you in the next episode. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.